Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, Blessed and Beautiful Homestead. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tina and I'm the creator of this YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me today for another video here in the kitchen on the homestead. I am really excited for those of you that follow me on Instagram and on the community wall here on the channel. You know I have been blasting you guys with photos and some videos of my brand new sandwich loaf that I feel like I have finally mastered, and I'm so excited to share it with you guys. As a homesteader, we have certain things that are staples here in our home, right? Like bread or yogurt, fresh eggs, things like that. Learning how to plant a vegetable garden, learning how to can and preserve. There's nothing better than the smell of fresh baked bread in the house. Recently, if you guys joined me over on my 20,000 subscriber giveaway video, I was sharing with you guys how I just got a Como grain mill for my birthday. This is kind of one of those things as a homesteader that I've always wanted, but it was very expensive. And also the learning curve with grinding your own flour and learning how to bake bread from that seemed a little daunting to me. So for my birthday, Joe got me this grain mill and I have been practicing in the kitchen for weeks now. I was like super excited to grind up some of my own flour, and I quickly learned that with my regular recipes that I already had on hand, they weren't coming out right with the fresh ground flour. So it was a little bit of a learning curve for me. I had to tweak some recipes and I had to get it just right. So I've made probably 10 to 14 loaves of bread just in the last couple of weeks, trying to perfect this loaf and get it just the way I want it. You can kind of avoid all the mistakes that I made because I've already made them for you. One of the things that I did when I got my grain mill is I purchased a good book that teaches you how to bake with fresh ground flour. I went online, I went on YouTube, I found several videos, but sometimes the bread just didn't turn out right and I wasn't very happy with it. And I'm like, you know what? Let me just go and get a book, something that has a lot of reviews, a lot of good reviews that seems like it works, and let me dive deeper into bread baking with homemade fresh ground flour, because it's like a whole different ball game. So my favorite recipe in this book is the basic yeast bread. And this basic yeast bread can be used for bread, it can be used for hot dog buns, hamburger buns, delicious dinner rolls. This recipe that I'm going to show you guys today, you can use for pizza crust. You can roll it out and put all kinds of savory, sweet goodies on the inside, and it's a great all-around yeast bread recipe for all those goodies in your kitchen. That's why I really wanted to specifically share this recipe with you. For those of you that don't really like to sit down and have the chatty time with me, feel free to click forward and go into the later part of the video where I'm actually going to be hands-on showing you how I make this loaf of bread. But for those of you that do want to chat with me, I want to dive into this just for a second because bread baking is some serious business, you know what I'm saying? So there was a couple of things that I noticed during this process of experimenting that I wanted to share with you. And maybe some of you guys already know the things that I'm going to be talking about, but for me as a bread baker, I've taught myself everything that I know. I've never had anybody there to teach me how to make a homemade loaf of bread or to teach me how to make homemade English muffins and all of these things that I'm trying to do here on my homestead so I don't have to go out to the store and buy processed bread for my family. One of the things that really bothered me about homemade bread, and this might sound silly to you guys, is I did not like the shape of the loaf of bread. I grew up on store-bought bread, and store-bought bread typically has that square look to it, right? Like if you're gonna make a sandwich, you've got those little squares that you pull out of that bag. Well, with homemade bread, your loaf usually rises a little above the pan, and then you've kind of got that big arch up there. And I also found that a lot of the recipes for sandwich bread didn't make tall enough loaves of bread. So when you cut into it to make a sandwich, it's essentially like the size of a half of a sandwich because it's not tall enough like that bread that we get from the store. So I racked my brain, Googled, looking at YouTube, trying to figure out how do you get that perfect rectangular loaf of bread so that when you cut into it, you've got those square pieces that we're all kind of used to from the store, right? So I found a little trick that I am super excited to share with you guys today, and it's really simple. It's called the Pullman loaf pan, and I'm going to show you guys how to use this in today's video. It's super simple. It's just like any other loaf pan, but it has a lid to it. So instead of your bread rising and getting the arch that we're used to it getting, you put the lid on this before you bake it. And the bread, the dough, hits the top while it's baking and it has nowhere to go. So in the end, when you take it out of the oven and you dump your bread out onto your cooling rack, you end up with this perfect rectangular loaf of bread that's just great for sandwiches. I've got these Pullman loaf pans off of Amazon. I got 2 of them. The recipe that we're going to be working with today is going to give you 2 loaves of bread. So make sure that you guys check out the links in the description box. I'm going to put the exact loaf pans that I got in the description, so you can click on them if you'd like to give them a try too. Now don't fret if you don't have one of these pans. You can use this recipe and make bread the way you normally would, and maybe you even like your bread to have that little arch over the top, so that's perfectly fine. But for those of you that are like me, that have been looking to make that perfect rectangular sandwich loaf, this is going to be the trick today. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you guys was kneading your dough. With this recipe, and I'm going to show you as we get into it, kneading the dough is really important, and this recipe can be kneaded by hand. You can knead it with a standing KitchenAid mixer, but you're gonna need to knead your dough in order for that gluten to develop, which is what gives bread or dough that stretchy, thicker consistency that we're looking for so that it rises properly and makes a really good sandwich loaf. When I started making this recipe and I mixed all my ingredients in the KitchenAid mixer, the recipe says to knead the dough for 5 to 6 minutes. Well, I'm going to tell you guys, after 6 minutes, that dough was very wet and very sticky. It was not the consistency that dough should be. So when your dough is properly kneaded, you should be able to pass the window pane test, right? Take a little chunk of that dough, stretch out the 4 corners, and if you can stretch it out without that dough breaking, then your gluten has developed properly and you're ready to make your bread. A lot of times previously, I didn't know that, so I would just do the amount of time that the recipe called for. Whether it was kneaded properly or not, I just went off the recipe and I went ahead and baked it, and it never came out right. It was either too dense or the consistency wasn't right. So what I learned with all my experimenting in the last couple of weeks is you can't always go off of the recipe when it comes to the kneading time, because it's all going to depend on how you're kneading your dough. If you're kneading it by hand, if you're using a KitchenAid mixer. And so one day I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna knead this dough in my KitchenAid mixer until I get that consistency that we're supposed to have that would pass the window pane test, and I'm gonna see how long it takes. Without fail, every time I make this perfect sandwich loaf in my KitchenAid mixer, you guys, it takes almost an exact 15 minutes to properly knead that dough for the gluten to form so that it would pass the window pane test. So you're tempted when it's wet and sticky and it's not forming. You're like, oh, I must not have added enough flour, and you're tempted to keep adding flour to your bowl. Don't do that. It's just that the gluten hasn't formed yet. It hasn't had enough time to knead. So let it go longer, and I promise you, if you followed the directions and your ingredients are right, that dough is gonna form and the gluten is gonna form properly, but you've gotta give it enough time. So that is one of the biggest tricks that I learned with bread baking, and specifically with this recipe here with the home ground flour, is you've got to give it enough time to knead without kind of freaking out and adding a bunch more flour in there thinking that it's too wet. Because the other thing that I wanted to share with you guys really quickly is, did you know bread needs to have a certain internal temperature for it to be considered done and ready? I never knew that. I would bake my bread as long as the recipe said to bake it, and I took it out of the oven not knowing whether it was really done or not, until I cut into it sometimes and found that it wasn't done in the center. So for bread, you want that internal temperature to be at 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So I have a little kitchen thermometer, and when I check my bread, insert that thermometer, and if it's not at 190, I put it back in for another minute or two, and I let it keep baking until it hits that 190 degrees. And every time, you guys, this bread comes out perfectly. So try that and see if it helps too. All right, you guys, so without further ado, let's jump into this recipe today. I am super excited to share this with you guys, and I hope that you enjoy it. Make sure you guys leave me some comments below after you make this sandwich loaf and let me know how yours turned out. All right, let's head into the kitchen. All right, let's get started with our ingredient list. So the first thing that you're gonna need, of course, is your wheat berries. You're gonna want 6 3/4 cup of flour for this recipe. So I use 4.5 cups of wheat berries because I want a little extra for dusting the counter. The next thing that you're gonna need is 2 1/4 cup of hot water, and then a 1/2 cup each of olive oil and also some delicious honey. You're gonna need 2 small eggs, and 1.5 tablespoons of active dry yeast, 3 teaspoons of a good salt, and then the last ingredient is optional. This is vital wheat gluten, and this is optional. You do not have to have this. It's made from the natural protein found in the endosperm of the wheat berry, and it gives shape, volume, and elasticity to baked goods. So just something else to help your bread really have that great texture that we want to have. It comes in this big bag on Amazon. I'll be sure to link everything I'm using in today's video in the description box, and I'll also put the recipe in there for you too. I think one of the most exciting things on my homestead is my grain mill, you guys. This thing has been so much fun to play with here in the kitchen. All you do is add your wheat berries, and it just grinds them down to this beautiful, soft, fine flour for your bread. Just keep an eye on it so your bowl doesn't overflow, and in a few minutes, we'll have a bowl of freshly ground flour. Now, while the grain mill is taking care of the flour, we're gonna add all the rest of our ingredients to our mixing bowl, everything except for the yeast. We don't wanna add the yeast until we've got some of that flour mixed up. If you don't have a stand mixer in your kitchen, no worries. You can mix this recipe together by hand and knead by hand as well. So don't fret if you don't have a mixer in your kitchen. Now I have already attached my dough hook, so I'm going to go ahead and give this a little whisk just to get all the clumps out before I start adding my flour to it. All right, it looks like our flour is about done. Look at that beautiful fresh flour, warm, straight out of the grain mill, and it smells so good, you guys. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna add 3 to 4 cups of this flour to the mixing bowl. Now go ahead and sprinkle that yeast on top of your mixture. Give that a good mix in, and then we're going to add the rest of our flour, 1/2 cup at a time, for a total of 6 3/4 cup. Now this recipe is forgiving, so if you guys get a little extra flour or a little less, don't worry, it's going to turn out just fine. Mix my flour and knead my dough on the number 2 setting of my KitchenAid mixer. I find that this is a perfect speed. And like I was telling you guys, we have a little bit of extra flour left over, which is great because we're going to need that for sprinkling the counter here in just a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and set our timer for 15 minutes so that we can knead our dough. I buy my wheat berries on Amazon in bulk. These are 25-pound bags. We store them in Mylar bags and 5-gallon buckets with oxygen absorbent packets. You guys, these wheat berries will last a really long time stored this way, and you're gonna have flour for a really long time. About 1 cup of wheat berries will grind into about 2 cups of flour. So you can imagine if you had some buckets full of wheat berries, you would be set for flour for a very long time. And just in case you were wondering, there are different kinds of berries, and this that we're using today is hard white wheat berries. So hard white wheat berries are great for bread baking. Soft wheat berries are best for making cookies and things like that. So just in case you didn't know, the grain that we're using today is hard white wheat berries. So we're gonna let this continue mixing. This is the consistency after about 8 minutes. This is way too sticky and wet. So we're gonna let it continue, and as it keeps kneading, you'll see that it's starting to thicken up and get a little bit more stretchy, and this is the consistency that we're looking for. After about 15 minutes, this is what my dough looks like. So this is done. My gluten has developed. It won't always pull completely away from the sides of the bowl, but the best way to check your dough to make sure it's ready is to do the window pane test that I was telling you guys about. Just work a little piece of dough in your hands, stretch out the 4 corners, and if it stretches well and doesn't break, then your dough is ready. You should be able to see the light on the other side through that thin membrane, and it shouldn't tear. Now, obviously, if you keep pulling it, it's going to eventually tear, right? So you don't want to pull it too far. We're just checking to make sure that we have a good elasticity in our dough. And we do, so we're ready to rise our dough. So now our dough is ready. We're going to put this in a warm place in our kitchen. I like to cover mine with plastic wrap and also put a little towel over it. I do this so that it doesn't get that hard, crusty film over the top of the dough. We want it to stay nice and soft. So just put some plastic wrap over it. You don't have to. You can use a towel if you'd like. That's just the way that I do it. We're going to go ahead and sit this over on the stove because I've got my stove preheating, so it's the perfect temperature over here to rise the bread. We're going to let this sit for 1 hour, and then we're going to come back and check on it. Look at that beautiful dough. So it's doubled in size. This is good. This is the texture, the consistency that we're looking for, and we're ready to shape our loaves. So to shape your loaves, you're just going to dust your counter with some of that leftover flour that we had, and then grab your dough and turn it out onto the counter. There's no need to punch the dough down. Just turn it out and scrape all the dough out onto the counter. It'll be a little tacky, and that's okay. That's what we've got the extra flour for. So now all you're gonna do, you guys, is separate your dough into 2 equal parts so you can have 2 separate loaves. We're gonna work the dough gently with our hands and make our logs or our loaves. I don't like to roll out my dough and roll it up because I find when I bake it, sometimes it gets this big gaping hole in the middle of my bread, and that's not good for making sandwiches, right? So I gently just pat together the sides and the centers, and as I do that, I pinch underneath as I'm pulling the dough together. Once you've got your loaf shaped, you're just going to gently lift it up and set it down in your greased baking pan, and then we'll head on to the next one. Now don't worry if your dough got a little wrinkled or a little messed up when you sat them down into the bread pan. Sometimes this happens. It doesn't have to be perfect. All the wrinkles will come out when the dough rises, so don't worry about that. Once again, I'm going to cover my dough with plastic wrap and a towel, and then we're going to let these set in a warm spot for about 45 minutes to rise. Once our loaves are done rising, what I like to do, especially for sandwich bread, is just brush my dough with some fresh milk. This is going to help give your crust that darker golden uh, color and also a little bit more of a firmer texture than the rest of the bread to give you that traditional sandwich loaf. Now I'm just going to score each loaf with just a center cut down the loaf. And this just helps when it's in the oven for expansion so that it doesn't kind of pop open in some crazy manner. It allows all of that to escape through the slit that we're making. Now we're going to cover our Pullman loaf pans with our lids. This is the trick to making them square like we talked about. And we're going to set these pans in the oven and we're going to bake them for about 40 minutes at 350 degrees, and we'll check and make sure that that internal temperature is at the 190-degree Fahrenheit mark that we need it to be at. When I cool my bread on a wire rack, I like to lay my loaves on their side rather than on the flat bottom to take the weight off the top of the loaf so that it prevents it from compressing. Now you should let your bread cool for at least 2 hours before cutting into it, but let's be honest, does that ever really happen? I like to bake my bread 2 loaves at a time because I like to freeze them for later. So I'll do up a couple batches of bread. So I've got bread for the next few months. And all you need to do is wrap it in plastic wrap and then put it in a Ziploc baggie, burp the air, mark it with the date, and put it in your freezer. And it's gonna last for a few months in there. So you don't have to worry about baking bread last minute. You're gonna have plenty on hand if you just think ahead a little bit. Since the loaves that we baked together today are still cooling, I got a loaf that I actually made yesterday. This one is completely cooled off, and I wanted to show you guys what this beautiful loaf of bread looks like once you cut into it. So get you a really good bread knife. What I love about this bread is the texture. Sometimes when you make homemade bread and you go to spread peanut butter on it or butter, it kind of falls apart. It's too fluffy. We want it fluffy but not too fluffy, right? So this recipe is awesome because the bread holds together and stands up really well. Because I knew somebody was going to ask me, I made another batch with regular all-purpose flour from the store, and this recipe converts just fine with regular flour from the store. These 2 loaves were made with all-purpose flour, not flour from my grain mill, and the only thing I noticed that was different is I needed to knead the dough for about 5 minutes longer, so about 20 minutes to mix the dough, and everything turned out great. I could not hardly wait to do this video and share it with you guys. I am loving this recipe. I love this sandwich loaf, and I hope that you do too. If you guys like this recipe and you found this video helpful, please take a second to click that thumbs up button for me so YouTube will share this with others. And if you haven't subscribed yet to our channel, please hit that subscribe button. We would love for you to become a part of our YouTube family. Once again, you guys, thanks for hanging out with me today in the Homestead Kitchen. And till next time, stay blessed, and we'll see you on the next video.